Hi everybody, welcome to the second lecture, Plant-Water Relations. Plants absorb water mainly through the end of roots or root hairs, and what you see here is a root hair that is growing in between two soil particles to access the soil moisture that you see here. Now when conditions are favorable for rapid root growth, a lot of root hairs can be developed even on a daily basis, and then they move through the small pore spaces in the soil, contacting and absorbing water. Now sometimes water can move toward absorbing roots, but really that's considered a lot less important than the roots moving toward the water in soils that are below field capacity. Now a number of things can cause barriers to root growth and water movement, things like soil types, unfavorable soil textures, water tables that might not be at an appropriate depth, maybe poor irrigation techniques. But what happens is that as water evaporates from plant foliage, there is a diffusion pressure deficit developed within the plant. And then the plant uses an involved mechanism to transmit this deficit, kind of in a chain-like reaction, to the root system where water is absorbed to satisfy that deficit. So what you see here is the surface of a leaf and what the cells tend to look like in that leaf, and I'll talk about that here. Plant cells and intercellular spaces absorb water by osmosis, and then by osmosis that water moves from areas of lower salt concentration through a semi-permeable membrane to an area of higher salt concentration. The root hairs are single cells of the epidermis layer with a large surface area, and each possesses a large vacuole which helps the process of osmosis. Now the water normally moves from the soil solution through the semi-permeable cell walls to the inside of the cell. The plant then moves water and nutrients upward through the xylem tissues to the leaves, where it's released to the atmosphere through leaf cells called stomata, and that's what you can see here. These are stomata, openings in the leaf. And the plant is able to control the concentration of water molecules inside the cells and to encourage water movement into the cells. Energy for the roots that are absorbing water is supplied in the form of sugars that are a product of the photosynthetic process. And these sugars are then transported downward through the phloem tissues to the roots. Then those roots that are active will respire just like we do, so taking in oxygen and giving off carbon dioxide. And just like we do, plants suffocate when there's a lack of oxygen, although for them that lack of oxygen would be in the root zone. Now energy is used to remove water from soil. So here you can see evaporation and transpiration occurring. It's moving that water from the soil. And as soil water tension increases, more energy is used by the plant to obtain that water. And then capillary forces are going to move that water slowly in the soils. And as the amount of water in the soil is reduced, the tighter that water is going to be held and the more difficult it's going to be for the plant to take up that water. So what the plant does is it then extends its root hairs to tap additional water being held in the soil pore spaces, and it renews its roots in areas where there are water supplies. So that's why optimum plant quality typically depends on moisture levels in the root zone that are fairly constant, especially during active growth. And as far as the irrigation goes, good irrigation practices provide an adequate water and oxygen supply for a healthy root system and encourage vigorous plant growth. Now the sum of water that is lost from the soil surface and through the plant leaves to the atmosphere is called evapotranspiration, or ET. And you're going to hear me refer to it a lot more often as ET. It's a lot easier to say. It's typically reported in depth units over time, such as inches per day, week, hour, month. And many factors are going to affect ET, including plant species, of course, what's going on with the weather, things like humidity, wind, and temperature, and then how the quality of the water is and the availability of that water. Now these two things, evaporation and transpiration, aren't independent from one another. Transpiration is influenced by the amount of evaporation from the soil surface, and evaporation from the soil surface is influenced by the amount of leaf area in the plant material growing there. So what happens with evapotranspiration, or ET, is that water is transferred from the soil to the atmosphere, and this concentrates the salts remaining in the soil solution. And if the salts in the soil solution have a high concentration, it can actually cause plants to die by preventing the absorption of water. Even at lower concentrations, salt tends to make water less available to plants, and that can result in poor plant quality. Now, another thing to keep in mind is that soil moisture has to be present for seeds to germinate, has to be present for plants to grow, but once the foliage is formed, most water is drawn from the soil through the plant by forces that initiate in the atmosphere, mainly radiation from the sun. Water is going to enable plant cells to remain turgid, so very important as far as that goes. And then the plants are also cooled as water evaporates from the plant foliage. And this process continues until the demand for moisture by the atmosphere exceeds the rate that water can be supplied through the plant roots. And that's the point where plant moisture deficit occurs and when stomata close. And when they do close, the release of water from the leaves into the atmosphere stops and the plant starts to wilt. Now, moisture deficits can be caused by lack of available soil water, lack of healthy root systems, or damaged plant transport systems. During the early stages of wilt, most plants recover turgidity during the night when the atmospheric demand for water is low. But if there isn't any additional water coming to the system, or if the weather doesn't change to reduce atmospheric demand for water, wilt starts to occur earlier and become more severe each succeeding day until it becomes so severe that plants are unable to regain turgidity during the night. Now, what you see here is a turf area that is under some soil moisture stress, and what I wanted to draw your attention to is the footprints that you see here. And what's happening is this grass is unable to regain turgidity because it has such high soil moisture stress, and so those footprints are made and tend to stay for a very long period of time. Now, plant water requirements are determined by a number of things, including plant species, leaf canopy, the stage of plant growth, climatic conditions, the available water, and soil physical factors as well. Transpiration rates are going to vary during the growing season with plants, depending on species, because of the stage of growth, even when the evaporative demand of the atmosphere remains nearly constant. A major climatic factor affecting ET is solar radiation, and it's the source of energy necessary to transfer water from a liquid to the vapor phase from plant leaves and the soil surface, so that ET process. Soil and air temperatures, humidity, rainfall, wind, and other plant characteristics also influence the ET of a given plant. Soil physical factors affecting ET include the quantity of available water in the root zone, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the soil temperature, and salt concentration. ET is going to be greater when the soil surface is wet and only partial plant cover exists than when the soil surface is dry and the plant canopy is nearly complete. Soil temperature affects the viscosity of water in soil, the vapor pressure, and the ability of roots to absorb water. And a lack of adequate soil aeration increases carbon dioxide concentration, reducing water absorption. Now, plants differ greatly in their ability to extract water from the soil and in the amount of water that they require. Some plants, in fact, are classified as drought tolerant because they can function in really dry soil conditions. And this drought tolerance can be due to several features, including waxy leaf surfaces, as you see here, hairy leaves, which actually reduce airflow past the leaf surface, reducing transpiration. Sometimes plants will have a shiny leaf surface because that reflects light and also reduces transpiration. They might have leaves that fold up, and these leaves may even drop during drought conditions to preserve other parts of the plant. Plants also might have really deep, well-developed root systems, but also be aware that too much water in the root zone for long periods can be damaging to plants because of the lack of oxygen in the area around the root hairs, which we discussed a little bit. Excuse me. With an irrigation system, this might occur when irrigation is applied too frequently or in too great an amount for the plant to utilize. Another concern would be the development of a shallow root system in response to too frequent irrigation. Now, ET is expressed in terms of a depth of water per unit of time, like inches per day, per week, month, or year. And it's a useful reference point for irrigation water calculations because it represents a specific rate of use in response to local weather conditions. And there are several ways to obtain estimates of ET, including places like the National Weather Service, USU's cooperative extension offices, or other university sources like the Utah Climate Center, and I'm sure there are other sources of weather station data as well. So potential ET rates, and these are just really should only be utilized as rules of thumb. Obviously, if you have actual data from a location, it's going to be better. But in general, if an area is considered cool and dry with average maximum temperatures of less than 70 degrees Fahrenheit, then the potential evapotranspiration is somewhere around 0.15 inches per day. In a hot, dry climate, however, where average maximum temperatures are greater than 100 degrees Fahrenheit, ET could be approaching half an inch per day. So that's a significant difference when you look at the whole of an irrigation season. Something else to consider is that there are species factors for landscape plants. Historically, these were called crop coefficients because they were used mainly in the production agriculture world, but we use them for landscape plants these days as well. And they're important for irrigation scheduling because different plants can vary considerably in their rates of ET. Some species transpire large amounts of water while others use relatively little. Now you can sometimes get more detailed species factors from local resources. Again, USU Cooperative Extension is one resource, or even the city or town that you live in might have this information in some kind of a plant list. And this tends to be a lot more accurate than the values that you see here, which are very basic guidelines. And these factors, be aware, they're also going to depend on characteristics of plant health, such as how much leaf area is there? What is the typical stomata behavior? How high is the plant? Is there reflected radiation from leaves? Or are there climate conditions like excessive radiation or reflective radiation, stage of growth, and the availability of soil water? All these things are going to vary throughout the year, and they're going to cause these species factors to change. So how much you use the information that you see here. As an example, what if you were working in a cool, dry climate and you wanted to get just a general plant water requirement for a high water use tree? Well, that plant water requirement is a function of reference ET and a species factor. So let's work through that example. So back to this table. So, got to remind myself, cool, dry climate. So cool, dry climate, average temperature of less than 70 degrees Fahrenheit, has an ET of 0.15 inches per day. So we use that table to get that bit of information. We put that into our equation, so that reference ET is 0.15 inches per day. What about the species factor? We said it was a high water using tree. So here's our tree, high water using tree, the species factor is about 0.9. So using that information and putting it into our equation, 0.15 times 0.9 equals 0.14 inches per day. So that is the plant water requirement in that particular situation. So in summary, we know that plants absorb water principally through root hairs. Plant cells absorb water by osmosis. Evapotranspiration, or ET, drives plant water requirements, and solar radiation drives ET. So I'll leave you with a little bit of food for thought, and we will move on.